Welcome to Doctors at Work. My name's Matt Daniel, and this podcast is part of my mission to help doctors create successful and meaningful careers. Now, normally I have a guest on the podcast, but this time it's a little bit different. It's just me, and I'll be talking about coaching for surgical performance. There are some slides as well, so if you are on audio, it'll work on audio, but if you're wondering what's he talking about, then you might want to have a look on YouTube, because some of the things might be a little bit easier if you see them. In the 1960s, Tim Galway was a tennis player, and he noticed that meditation made him play better tennis. And he postulated that the greatest barrier to achievement as an elite professional was the athlete's internal state of mind. And he went on to write about the idea that every game has two parts, the inner game and the outer game. So the outer game is what you see played against external opponents, external obstacles for external goals. And the inner game takes place in the athlete's mind against internal obstacles, such as fear or judgment, paralysis, self-criticism. With the outer game, the way that you improve your outer game is you train and you practice, you do various exercises, you learn, and you have a coach. And actually exactly the same with the inner game also. If you want to improve your inner game, you also need to learn, and you also need to practice, and you also need to work with a coach. Now, John Whitmore studied with Tim Galway, and John Whitmore is the person that's credited with taking the idea of coaching for performance and inner game coaching from that elite sports world into the world of business, executive decision making, and leadership. And John Whitmore is the originator of the GROW model, which to this day remains probably the foundation model when it comes to coaching for performance in that kind of business executive context. And the GROW model is a model for structuring coaching conversation. GROW stands for goal, reality, options, way forward. And that's a way that a coach might structure a conversation. And actually anybody in a kind of medical context, whether you're working with your colleagues or whether you're using it in your role as a head of service leader or a trainer, you can use this very simple model to structure a coaching conversation. And let's kind of think in terms of operative performance, how that might go. So the goal might be, okay, I want to carry out a procedure in relatively good time without getting stuck, with good outcomes. So that's my goal. Okay, what's the reality at the moment? But the reality is I reach a certain step, then I worry about what's going on. I find ways to distract myself. I do anything other than needing to progress. So it's taking a very long time. I get stressed. Everybody around me gets stressed. Then the things don't proceed, and then eventually it moves on. And that's the reality of the moment. Okay, so how might I go from that to something that is seamless and smooth? That means that I don't get stuck at a particular stage when things are tricky, that I'm able to move on without procrastinating and without worrying. So how can I do that? Well, it may be that I need to operate with somebody else, or I need more training, or somebody else needs to operate with me, or I need to get feedback, I need to do video recording, or maybe I need to go and work with a coach and talk to a coach about the fact that I worry, that I overanalyze, that I procrastinate, that I stress, that I catastrophize. And the way forward would be that, I will go and talk to a senior doctor about how they do that, and I will go and work with a coach specifically around my psychology of how I approach difficult, challenging procedures. So that's kind of how that GROW model might work in practice. Now, you're wondering, what on earth has any of this got to do with surgeons? All of this performance psychology, well, that's fine, if you're an elite performer, but for us as surgeons or as doctors, surely for us it's all about performance. We turn up and we do a task, and we maybe that we have skills, technical as well as non-technical, but it's just around us doing that. It's skills, what's this got to do with our psychology? But actually, you don't have to look very far to find some examples of really quite spectacular failures of inner game when people's ways of thinking have gone spectacularly wrong. Now, that might be because you're a liver surgeon branding your initials onto a patient. It may be because you've done unnecessary procedures. It may be because of sexual assault in surgery. It's incredible, what are people thinking? 1 in 3 female NHS surgeons have been sexually assaulted. What's going on in people's mind there? Why? Or it may be that it's academic fraud. What goes through your mind to try and commit something like that? And the reality is that hopefully most of us are not psychopaths, but we do know that there's an awful lot of stress and there's an awful lot of burnout and an awful lot of people are struggling. So you might not be a psychopath and your inner game might not be causing harm to patients, but it may be there is an issue with how we think and how we treat ourselves and how we value our time and our well-being. And also that interferes with our performance at work, because it's well recognized that poor staff well-being leads to poorer patient outcomes. Okay, so what is coaching? So coaching is a learning, thought-provoking adult development process. It's a relationship between two equal people. So the coach doesn't tell you what to do. The coach isn't an expert. The coach doesn't give you advice. It's a relationship between two equal people. The coach asks questions and the coach listens and the coach gives feedback. And predominantly the coach spends most of the time listening and they ask you questions and they might give you some feedback, and that may be challenging at times also, but principally they don't tell you what to do. The coach asks questions and the coach listens. Coaching is focused on change and action, and it can help you facilitate performance or development or transformation. I'd like to draw a distinction between coaching and mentoring. So I've talked about coaching already. Developmental mentoring for me is really quite similar to coaching. The major difference being that in mentoring, it's typically a more senior person, a more senior mentor that supports learning and development of another person in a similar role. And that might be formal or that might be informal. And just distinguishing that from sponsorship mentoring, which is an influential senior patron who passes on tips and hints and influences your career progression. I quite like to think of coaching and mentoring, other things that we do, along a continuum that's problem focused versus solution focused and asking versus telling. And if you think coaching and mentoring, principally they're about asking questions and they're focused on solution. In medicine, for example, people come with a problem and we tell them what to do. In counseling, again, people come with a problem. The counseling might ask you about how you might move forward. But coaching and mentoring is asking questions and it's focused towards solutions. And importantly, coaching is not always the right thing to do. If somebody doesn't know the anatomy, if somebody doesn't know a particular step, if somebody doesn't have knowledge or they don't have the skill, it doesn't matter. You can ask them as many times as you like whether they know the anatomy of whatever structure. If they don't know it, they need to be told. So they need training. They need something much more didactic. So if it is a matter of knowledge, people don't have the knowledge, coaching isn't necessarily the right thing there. But coaching is for helping people figure out their way forwards. Remember, it's that relationship between two equal people, trying to get people to tap into the resources, into what they already know, and figuring out their own way forwards. And the reason why that matters is because how I do something, that might not be right for you, yeah? So, I can tell you this is how you do a tonsillectomy, but that might not be right for you. It may be that both of us will probably both of us will get equally good outcomes, but both of us will do something differently. And again, if it's a really challenging step and I say, well, this is how I do it, I don't understand, why are you paralyzed by fear? I've shown you this is how you do it, you just move on. Again, that works for me. That way of thinking might work for me. That way of dealing with that step might work for me. So that didactic approach doesn't really work for somebody who's a grown-up independent practitioner. Coaching works much better because it helps you figure out your way of doing stuff. Not me telling you how I do it, although that might be helpful, but it's asking questions and listening to help you figure out your way of doing stuff. And your way of doing stuff will be different to my way of doing stuff, because the only person that can know what's right for you is you. And that's why coaching is so powerful. Okay, so let me kind of give you some examples as to where coaching might be useful when it comes in surgical performance. Let's say that you're a trainer in theatre or really anything else that involves a procedure, whether that's a ward round or a cardiac arrest, endoscopy, whatever it might be. Let's say that you have somebody who's very competent, not particularly slow, they're making good progress with the training, but you notice that all the time they're rushing and therefore they're making mistakes. So on a very superficial level, as a trainer, I might say, stop making mistakes. If I'm a little bit more interested, I'll notice that they're rushing and making mistakes. So I might say to the trainee, stop rushing. But as a coach, or whether I use a coaching skill as part of my training, I might be interested in finding out what is it that makes that person rush? Is it that they're worried that they're going to be criticized? Do they understand the pace that they work? Have they got insight into their own skills? Do they know that there's a link between them rushing and making mistakes? Do they realize that actually they're not particularly slow? And trying to unpack all of those things. What are they thinking? What are the reasons why they're rushing? What's going through my mind? What do they know about themselves? What are their expectations of themselves? Do they understand, what the implications of that behavior is? That's kind of how I might use coaching with that kind of trainee. I hope you're enjoying the show. Please click subscribe so you'll be notified when new episodes become available. This podcast is part of my mission to help doctors create successful and meaningful careers. You can be part of that mission too by forwarding this show to one person who you think might benefit from listening. Thank you. Now on with the show. Okay, so let's imagine another trainee, somebody who doesn't seem to take much in. You tell them how to do things and they can't do it. You tell them how to do things, they can't do it. You tell them how to do things, they can't do it. And then you think, okay, I've told this person several times, but they are still struggling to perform a particular step. Again, on a superficial level, I might say, just do better. Or I might go as far as to say, this person's untrainable. I've shown them they're not making progress. That kind of might be superficial stuff. As a coach, again, whether an independent coach or whether I'm using my coaching skills as part of my training role, I might say, okay, what's going on through that person's mind? If I've told them things and they haven't taken that in, what's going on? And I might have a discussion with them, what's going through my mind, what's going through their mind when I am giving them information or when I'm giving them feedback. And you might find that person's mind is actually somewhere completely different. Perhaps they've got stuff that's going on in the background. They haven't slept. Maybe they've got difficult family circumstances. And actually, their head is so full of other stuff that the training relating stuff just doesn't have anywhere to go. And that's really important because then you recognize that what that trainee needs is before that trainee is going to have the headspace to learn, that trainee needs to focus on their well-being. And of course, there'll be different ways of doing that. But that ends up, for me, being a much more powerful way of working with that trainee rather than telling them do better or, you can't be trained. I've already used the example of a surgeon that gets to a certain stage and is paralyzed by fear. And again, coaching can be really useful there to really try and understand what's going on through that person's mind. And often some of the things that can be really helpful would be to try and think what are the worst possible things that can happen and to try and mentally rehearse what might go wrong in your mind so that you say, okay, if this happens, we're going to do that. If it's this, then that. If it's a variation in anatomy, it's this. If there's something that happens, that's what I'm going to do. So that in the cold light of day, you can rehearse what you would do if things go wrong. And then once you've rehearsed all of that, you've got a plan of action, all of that you can then put away. So that when you're operating, instead of saying, don't make a mistake, 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 you can focus on what it is that you want to do. Because the act of having worked through the worst case scenarios, of mentally preparing a plan, that can be helpful because it just allows you to then put that aside and not worry about it. And the final example where coaching might be helpful that I would talk about would be somebody who does have an adverse outcome, but then changes their practice completely as a result of that adverse outcome. Now, that might be good because it may be that they were doing something wrong before, and this is good learning, that learnings happened and they can and things improve. But actually what often happens is something happens and perhaps the practice need not have changed as dramatically as it might have done. So from a coaching point of view, what's the person worried about? What are the reasons that the practice have changed? And there may be good reasons, there might not be good reasons, but also what are the implications for practice changing? Because if somebody has an adverse outcome and the result is that they become much, much more conservative in what they do, that might be denying some patients the option of really something that would be good for them in an appropriately consented and trained format. But if you go from one end to completely the other and you become very conservative in your practice, that's not good for patients either. So trying to understand what are the causes that somebody has changed what they do, what's good and what's bad about that, and making a rational decision rather than an emotive one. Okay, and one of the things that for me is really interesting is that as doctors, it's not that often that we fail. Majority of the time we get good outcomes. Majority of our patients do well. Majority of our patients even in palliative care settings or whatever settings you have, the outcomes, we deliver good things for our patients, and majority of the time the patients get high quality care, but of course not always. And that's exactly the opposite for elite performance, because if you are an elite sports person, you fail all the time. If you're an elite musician, you will go for auditions all the time, and all the time you won't get parts. And that kind of is very different in that elite sport, elite performance world. People fail all the time, whereas as doctors we don't. And a real key to performing at that really high pressure as an elite person is being able to deal with failure. So if things don't go to plan, what do you deal with that? How do you recover? How do you turn yourself around? Both at that very moment, because it might be in the middle of a game that you need to turn yourself around. You can't afford sort of to start crying and being miserable and feel sorry for yourself in the middle of a game. You need to flick yourself around and start doing the next set or whatever it might be. But that's a mindset, yeah. And the mindset there is of, if there's a failure, what can I learn from that? It's planning ahead and having some rehearsals and some plans and some strategies in place about how you will turn any failure around. And the problem is that as doctors, I'm not convinced that that's the kind of mindset that we have in healthcare, because we don't have adverse outcomes all that often. And of course, when we do, it's terrible for our patients, and it's terrible for us as healthcare professionals also, because we also worry. And that then can mean that instead of focusing on what learning can be had, it becomes much more destructive, and whether that's in a kind of somebody's mental state or somebody's engagement at work, and that's not great. It would be much better if, instead of disengaging and instead of procrastinating and worrying when things don't go according to plan, if the focus was learning. So there's something here about mindset, the mindset of how do you deal with adverse outcomes? How do you deal with things don't go according to plan? And some of that might be preparation, some of that might be focusing on learning, but that mindset is really important. So if you believe that stress is bad for you, then stress will be bad for you. If you believe that you can't do a certain procedure, then you won't be able to do a certain procedure. If all the time somebody's saying, oh, you made a mistake last time, you made a mistake last time, you made a mistake last time, then you will make a mistake this time also. And if you have strong emotions because of what's happened at home or with a previous patient or earlier in the day, if you're taking all of that from one patient to the next, from one interaction to the next, all of that is going to get in the way. Yeah. And of course, all of that is changeable. And a really good way, or a really good question to ask yourself is, how is this way of thinking serving me? And if this way of thinking is not serving you, then let it go. Now, coaching can help you perform better. So, we talked about procedures, leading ward round, operating, and coaching for performance. That's where the GROW model, goal, reality, options, way forward, that's where that model sits. That's coaching for performance. But coaching can also help with your personal development. So that's getting to know yourself better. How do I react to stress? How do I think? What makes me tick? What do I get stuck on? What kind of things make me angry? So that's about getting to know yourself better. So that's coaching for development. And coaching can also be transformational, by which I mean that you have a completely new worldview that arises as a result of coaching. And an example there might be that you see yourself as an expert, as the go-to person, the best surgeon for a certain procedure, but that, of course, comes with a lot of stress, because you always have to be the best person. You always have to say yes. And then maybe somebody else comes along and they're fresher and they're better trained, and they're younger and more energetic than you are. And actually, your own image of yourself as the main person that has all the answers, that image changes to somebody that says, well, actually, I'm not perfect. It's okay that I ask for help. I'm no longer the best person. There's somebody else that's better. So that kind of would be an example of a really transformational change in mindset. Now, as doctors, we are under enormous pressures and enormous strains, and there are very high expectations that the system places on us. But we are all the time trying to do more and more. We're trying to go faster and faster. We're trying to work harder and harder. And that is very much coming at a significant cost to our own personal well-being. And that in turn is now also leading to cost in healthcare system, because the fact that healthcare professionals are so much affected by poor well-being, that then is also feeding back into how the system operates itself. And the problem is, if we just carry on doing what we've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And I think that it's time that we spend a little bit more of our time focusing on the medical inner game.